Well, with more on this, we're now joined by Wendy Gilmour. From 2022 to 2024, Ms. Gilmour was seconded to NATO, where she served as Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment. She has a distinguished record as a Canadian diplomat, and these days sits on the board of directors for the Conference of Defense Associations Institute, where she serves as Vice Chair. She joins us today from the Canadian Forces College in Toronto. Wendy, good to see you again. Thank you for making the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
So this 2% target of GDP, this achievement, what does it say to you about the changing attitude in Canada about the need to shore up our defense capabilities?
I think it's a really important target that we have met this year. The Prime Minister announced last June that we would get to 2% in year, and we're coming in under the wire because it's the end of the fiscal year in another week. It is critical that I think Canada has stepped up to the commitment that we made back in 2014 with the rest of the NATO nations. But at the same time, it's not just about the 2%, it's also about the additional investments that are going to go beyond that, so that we're aiming to hit our 5% by 2035. Mm-hmm. These are necessary investments for our own security, clearly.
Okay, necessary investments. Can you make the argument for that? Because I think the vast majority of Canadians, when we look at the polling numbers, are on side, but there's still a significant number of Canadians who are not convinced that the money's worth it.
I think you start off with the geopolitical environment is very clear for anyone who is looking at world events to see it's a more difficult world, it's a more difficult place. Our traditional alliances that Canada has relied upon to provide for our security, to allow us to be in effect what economists would call a freeloader for our defense for so many years. Not to say that we haven't made real contributions, but that we have been spending less than our own security would demand because of our alliances and our reliance on others like the United States. Right now, it's very clear that we can no longer make those assumptions. We have to be prepared to step up in support of our own defense needs, our own security needs. And that means reinvesting in the Canadian forces, reinvesting in the infrastructure we need domestically to be able to provide for our security, and frankly, being able to have the necessary capabilities to project power abroad when it's in our interest to do so.
Yeah, project power abroad. That brings me to my other question here, because we have seen a number of deals signed and announced in the past few weeks. They include a security and energy corridor in the Arctic, a launch pad in Nova Scotia for satellites, new rifles and ammunition. What do you make of these investments? Are they the kind of investments that can assure our other NATO allies that Canada has the capability to step up in a moment of crisis?
That's a very interesting question, because if you look at it first from a NATO perspective, NATO as an institution is primarily interested in the security of the Euro-Atlantic area, which means that its planning, the infrastructure that it supports is designed to project power in the Euro-Atlantic space, which means the eastern side of NATO, from the edge of Greenland over to Europe and out to the eastern flank. NATO's activities as an institution have never focused on providing for the security of North America, let alone explicitly Canada. We have done that separately through NORAD and through whatever investments we make in our own unique sovereign defense. So from NATO's perspective, that 2% figure is really a costed amount that previously, and now the 5%, is a costed amount of what it would be required to defend Europe from whatever threats are coming. And when I say Europe, really the Euro-Atlantic space. So for Canada to say, all right, we've made our 2%, if we're really taking a hard look at our own security needs, that number was never going to be adequate. That number meets our international commitments, but it doesn't really speak to what we need to do at home. And our security at home, the security and our obligations to North America through NORAD, is supplementary to what that 2% actually meant. So that means, frankly, the 5% it's not an excessive amount. It's probably, if not just enough, it's maybe even not enough as we look at what our security needs are going to be going forward.
And we know that, for example, modernizing early warning signals is part of what Canada has already engaged in vis-a-vis NORAD. But when you look at the additional, the up from 2 to 5% of NATO commitment, what else do you think Canada should be investing in?
So the 2%, and I've heard members of Department of National Defence, Canadian Forces speak to the money that they were given in year, that additional 9.3 or so billion dollars that was announced last June by Prime Minister Carney, has been deployed to support many of the necessary, call it the backbone of the Canadian Forces, salaries for the Canadian Forces, the men and women that are in uniform, the infrastructure investments, the getting a better supply of spare parts. It's really us bringing us up to where we needed to be able to then launch the new investments in capability to really address the significant gaps in readiness that the Canadian Forces have, including the targets that were established through the government's defense industrial strategy released a month and a half or so ago. So the critical piece, what we need to do next is say, all right, now what are we doing to modernize the capabilities we have? What are we doing to plan forward for what the new conflict environment is going to demand of us? So yes, the members of the Canadian Forces need personal weapons and rifles. There's no question there. But they also need integrated air and missile defense. They also need the ability to do what the military would call long-range fires, deep precision strike. We need better sovereign intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, many of which were already identified in the government's existing policy, our True North Strong and Free and Strong, Secure, Engaged, the last two defense policy documents. So these additional monies will allow the government to actually deliver, to implement what their policy is already telling them to do.
Well, as we say, a significant benchmark being announced today. We look to see what happens as this increases to 5%. Wendy, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.